This is a message for the official opposition party, the DA in South Africa. It's interesting because there are a lot of lessons that can be learnt from President Trump, but obviously the situation in America is very different from the situation in South Africa, and in some sense, that forces a level of political strategy to be. It has to be perfect, or I mean, it has a high. In some sense, President Trump's strategy, uh, as far as I can see, is quite a sensible strategy. I don't know if it's that useful for me to detail my opinion of what's going on in America and how his political strategy is actually probably probably very finely tuned, and actually does function for the kind of ideological opposition and the kind of witch hunts that attach to him. That it's very good at mediating between those things, while all the time sort of promoting the solid base of civic nationalism as being a rational and reasonable political platform, and he has done well at sort of being the flag bearer of civic nationalism, and proving that he really is a civic nationalist. Um, and you can see that in terms of how he has placated towards this Black Lives Matter movement, um, which is, to be nitpicking or to be detailed, is obviously a symptom of this greater hysterical, ideologically captured media, and this kind of this toxic left wing mob mentality of witch hunting and scapegoating, in essence, and how it just toxically sort of just imports this systemic oppression narrative or whatever. So anyway, so I see President Trump as a very smart political operator in how he is managing those contentions. South Africa is a much more delicate, is a much harder environment. He We're up against more in South Africa than he is up against in America. Um, and in America, there are very clear voices. You have the benefit of Tucker Carlson, which says very very reasonable things. And Tucker Carlson is very critical of the GOP. He is, he's just the voice of reason, and that is obviously very helpful. Okay, the South African situation. So the thing that I have to say about the DA is that, I mean, I read these newsletters from John Steenhuisen, the leader, and he makes brilliant intellectual arguments, and he's got a lot of the theory really well done, and he's saying the right things on an intellectual level. But at some point, you're going to have to find an incident. You're going to have to find a scenario, I'll say you what the incident could. You have to find an incident to respond to in which you actually launch a counter polemic. You're not going to get traction if you don't say something that is actually confrontational and abrasive against this ideological confection of capture by this fascistic ideology of group think, and looking and interpreting the world through stereotypes, and which those stereotypes will always facilitate corruption, will always facilitate unaccountable leadership and unaccountable policy that cannot be refined or improved because the policy itself is junk. And I had a whole video where I spoke about how essentially when you use identity politics and policy, the policy is always trash because it uses the superficial designation of targeting benefits towards beneficiaries that will always make the policy itself um, unspecific. It will be unrealistic. It won't actually tend to the actual conditions. It won't attend to the real problems. Because if you forced yourself to apply policy in a non-racialist way, you would have to be specific. You would have to create objective criteria, and those criteria would be refined, and you would actually target disadvantages that then would be ameliorated, and that would be far more effective than using superficial things, which essentially is just becomes wasted resources, and you create unsustainable pseudo transformation, which becomes more costly to sustain the pretense thereof. And it's just identity politics has always been fake pandering in essence, and a wonderful human shield for plutocracy and corruption. Okay, so John Steenhuisen, I'm sure, understands all of this stuff. The thing is that you actually have to call it out and vilify it and confront it, and in a very in an emotionally engaging way as well. You have to leverage something against the poison that it is, and you have to you really have to go after it, and you have to be seen to be go after it. And and so you either have to pick the time to actually launch this counter polemic, um, and I guess, you might want to say, well, look, I can't just look like I'm making hot air. I can't just look like I'm just inventing this this exasperated, uh, um, highly charged, thing. I guess, you want to look like that you're taking the most conservative, reasonable interpretation of events or whatever. But in some sense, I mean, the incident that you could be responding to in launching the counter polemic is that we're slowly boiling. We're like the frog that doesn't jump out of the pot because the temperature is going up a degree at a time, and we're slowly, essentially, degrading, and there's a lot of degradation that has already happened, which you could be upset about. Which, how academia and legal theory and policy has corrupted and confected, essentially, the Brett Weinstein podcast is really, you should listen to that one, the one about sleeper cells, and I can't remember the rest of the title of the podcast. I'll put a link to it with this recording, but it's like, but he talks about the horizontal revolution, and its kind of fascistic, sort of thing, and he describes some themes which I think are very important. Um, but yeah, I think it's important to make a counter polemic in order to expose people to the alternative way of thinking, because essentially right now there's no moral challenge to the status quo, and there is, let's say, a political challenge and a political alternative, I guess, but it doesn't look prominent enough because it doesn't make a robust moral claim that is actually going after the way that things are currently operating. And there must be a moral challenge. That must be the core of the counter polemic. I keep on saying the moral corruption is the medium of the state capture and the political corruption, or the plutocratic elite or whatever. And in some sense, I would try to also promulgate a sense of good faith when you make these arguments. And in some sense, I would even go as so far. I mean, obviously, I'm not in politics and I'm not a political leader, but my suggestion would be to even go so far outside of the comfort zone to show your good faith by saying, if you cannot vote for the DA because it has a white leader, or because you don't like our politics, or because you think of something racial or whatever, I implore you, vote for COPE. Vote for one of the other parties that don't have this style of fascistic identitarian corruption of the state, essentially, that facilitate this disgusting form of politics. Just don't vote for, essentially, just don't vote for the ANC and the EFF and what is it, Black First Land First. I don't know if they made, no, I think they were barred to making a political organization because you can't have one that's racially exclusivist or something. But essentially, I would even go so far as to that and just say, look, there are many opposition parties to choose from. Just don't vote for the EFF and don't vote for the ANC, so that we can get out of this mess. That it doesn't necessarily have to be the DA, that there are other good people in politics or something like that. Just, I know that sounds like an insane thing for a political party, for the leader of a political party to say, but it's somewhat, then at least, you're at least going to great lengths to try and show the the honest belief in your framework. Because I mean, a lot of people, they need a bit of a shock in order to actually think about these things. A lot of people essentially have been just captured because, when you've got some people hysterically creating these complaints about systemic oppression, it's like, they just sort of, they just become part of the zombie horde. I mean, maybe not in the center of the zombie horde, but they just sort of, they appease it as a kind of, they don't want their life to be that complicated, and they need someone to put it in stark terms, to put it in the, and in some sense, it is a bit of a complicated thing how it is morally corrupt, but to also make links between how that moral corruption leads you to a form of statecraft which is just fundamentally plutocratic and fundamentally also unsustainable, and it doesn't deliver. And in some sense, it always just has to pass the buck. It needs a scapegoat to operate. It needs a scapegoat to even ground its worldview. It's so toxic and poisonous. Okay, so I guess that's my basic piece, is that, I mean, obviously, when you do these sorts of things, obviously it's a bit of a gamble in some sense because you're putting political capital on the line. And if there isn't, let's say, a feedback or response, or because in some sense, you're trying to make a wave, you're trying to sort of rattle, you, you know, you're just trying to shake up something in some sense. You're trying to make some noise. I guess it's almost like an activist kind of of um of rhetorical tactic or something like that. But I do think that in some sense, I mean, that you need to make a simple form of the moral argument and the counter polemic, and then also have other forms of that counter polemic formulated in other ways, so that you've got detail to back up the, because you actually want to hear the bigoted and stupid responses to your counter polemic. You want to hear the the cherry picked interpretate, the over interpretate, a kind of a bad. You want to hear the bad faith interpretations of your counter polemic, because that is what you should be then focusing on. In so you after you mount the counter polemic and you express it, then the whole thing becomes defending it and holding the line, as it were. And that's what you want. You want to field the criticism, and you want to genuinely try find the sharpest thing in that criticism, and then you dispel it. And then that is how you make ground, is by dispelling the feedback from the wave that you make. So you make a wave, and then it sort of rebounds back on you, and then you're doing this because you want to showcase that you can be cornered by all of these bad actors, and you can show them out to be bad actors. And this is how you essentially bring the fight to yourself, essentially. And you hold the line and you prove the case that way. And it's too much that I hear people making accusations and claims against the DA, and they're not made in response to something that the DA says. It's just a general claim. It's just a general accusation. The way to get in front of that is by essentially making the first move, so that when they are making their claims, they're making it against something that you have actually specifically done or said. That it's not just this vague accusation that's being made against the party, that it's a specific counter argument. And then you've got that sense of dialogue, and you can also, within that sense of dialogue, in some sense, you can make progress that way by essentially entracting people into the argument and winning the argument, rather than essentially this weird kind of politics, which, I mean, is classical of the kind of fascistic rhetoric that you're up against, because essentially it's just straw manning. It's just essentially very hollow lies or whatever. And in some sense, if you get out in front of it, then at least if anyone ever does listen to your responses, they've got a very clear sense that there isn't an actual ideological opposition to your platform. It isn't an honest ideological opposition. Um, that it's just deceptive, that it's just feeble, and it's launched by people that have other agendas and that who are obviously bigoted themselves and such. So anyway, I mean, I haven't described this perfectly, but that I think is the general my general suggestion of the way to go. Um, and that does force, let's say, politicians within the DA to actually have substance that they need to be able to defend, because then their party actually stands for something. It actually has a robust ideological position that is in confrontation to the identity politics. It isn't just this amorphous, um, I guess, sort of blob. It is actually, it actually has real values and a real doctrine that it believes in, and that it's capable of defending and arguing against, because in some sense that's the biggest problem that politics has in general, is that there is no substance. It's just symbolic gestures, which is what identity politics fundamentally is. It's that, oh, we're on team this stereotype, and everyone who doesn't go with us is some other stereotype and is for some other stereotype, and it's all this kind of, I mean, it's actually a kind of disgusting sort of ethno-state politics, or ethno-nationalistic politics, but your nation becomes your identity faction. And your real interest is not in the promotion of the nation, but it's in the promotion of the identitarian faction. It's complete fascistic bullshit. It completely dissolves liberal politics. And so it's obviously quite devastating when we have the Chief Justice himself being an ideologue for identity consciousness. It's disgusting. Um, that is something that, again, I keep on every time I say things like this. The DA is up against a lot. It's up against essentially the majority of academia. I mean, it's hard to say, because this horizontal revolution is so toxic. It's very hard to voice dissent against it. It's very hard to actually, maybe cataloging all the different repression that is being exerted from this mob mentality, and this, which is part of essentially which is kind of like the human shields of the plutocratic corrupt elite, which can essentially just continue to ad nauseum get away with everything, because all they have to do is virtue signal that they're on the right side of history, and it doesn't matter how stupid their policy it is. It doesn't matter how unsustainable the fiscus is. It doesn't matter, because essentially they can just make reality up as they go along and just blame systemic oppression the whole time, that anything doesn't go their way. So it's this never-ending cycle of political unaccountability. Um, that's what this ideology facilitates. It is totalitarian, fascistic political consciousness. It is the conception of society as groups, and they have disgustingly destroyed and perverted the phrase social justice to mean justice between groups, instead of justice for the individual against groups and all the groups and the group of society at large. That is what social justice actually means. Is the individual against society. It's not against groups versus groups. I mean, so disgusting. So these people have undermined and betrayed the Constitution, and that moral corruption has led us to where we are. Has led us to I mean, we're sort of uh, uh, 10 minutes to midnight on sort of the banana state, banana republic. I mean, that's. I mean, I guess it's arguable that the fiscus is already perhaps locked into a debt trap, but okay, that's I guess the end of this recording.